if any of you watched the Oscars the other night, and you thought it was as awful a show as I did, I heard a Nora Ephron line that I'd never heard before when they showed the in memoriam clip of her. They had her saying, the hardest thing about writing is writing. And so I thought that would be a very good way to kick off what I'm going to be talking about. Just give you a little of my own perspective and how I got into this, because it's usually one of the first questions I'm asked. And also to tell you that since I am about on the 89-yard line, or whatever, it's the old football analogy, works well for the guys. But anyway, I'm like 5 minutes away from getting to the end of a manuscript, and it's late and it's overdue. And writing really is the hardest part of writing. The discipline for those of you who are writing and trying to write, that discipline of getting to the pages every day and being in the words is both the hardest part about it and for me the most joyful part about it. But it's certainly difficult. So I'm always asked, well, why did you start writing after, or actually during a career as a prosecutor? If you were to find my junior high school and high school yearbooks, which I hope you don't, in all of them when it says, what do you want to do, ambition, it was always to be a writer. It's what I loved doing as a kid. I used to write stories. I always had that in mind. I went to college to major in English Lit. I had a very loving father, a very supportive father. But when anybody came for dinner and Aunt Mary would say, what do you want to do, dear, with that English Lit degree, and I'd say, be a writer, my father would roll his eyes and say, you have nothing to write about, get a career. And sort of at the end of college, of 4 years studying English Lit and going to the library and writing in the garret and writing short stories and journals and papers, I realized that I was not in any way prepared to try to support myself doing that. My second interest, I graduated from college in 1969, and my second interest was public service. It was very much as a teenager during the John Kennedy years and the ask not what your country can do for you appeal to public service that really hit so many people in and around my age. And so I decided to go to law school with a view to doing some kind of public service. I had no idea what. That's why I applied. I went from an all-women's college, and most of you don't look old enough to remember, but there were many careers closed to women at that point in time. So there were 350 students in my law school class, and only 11 of them were women. And so when I decided, when I got to law school, it was just one of those great circumstances. The way I had an English Lit professor who was my guru through my 4 years of college. My criminal law professor from the first moment I got to school was the most dynamic, engaging, and not unimportant in my life, was one of the few people open to women in the criminal justice workplace. And doors for me. I applied. I wanted to be a prosecutor because the Manhattan DA's office in those days, late 60s, early 70s, was deemed to have the best prosecutors training ground in the country. Frank Hogan was the district attorney when I was hired. He'd been there for 28 years. He was a very fair, very decent man. He'd changed the nature of the big city prosecutor's office everywhere across the country. They were sort of known as being clubhouses for cronies. I mean, if you were the Democratic district attorney, then everybody from your club was guaranteed to have a job or their kid to have a job. And Frank Hogan sort of changed that in the 50s and 60s. And the only change he was not interested in making was women in the workplace. And in those days, for the EEOC rules, you could say to young women, as he said to me, this job is too tawdry for a woman of your educational background. What is it? I was born and raised in Mount Vernon, New York. I went to a public high school. I went to Vassar College. I went to UVA Law School. Woo. And he said, wow, all right. Thank you. And Frank Hogan said, there is just no way that somebody with your educational background is prepared to meet victims of violence, to see these criminals in the courtroom and deal with them. And he was allowed to say that. And so he hired women, there were only, I was the 7th one on the staff of 200, to be in the law library, to work not with witnesses. He said to do blood and guts in the courtroom was just not appropriate for young women. So he hired us to be in the law library, which I thought was great. You were doing the supposedly more intellectual work, and we all wanted to be in court, but I wasn't kicking down any doors. We would be doing appellate work and also doing a lot of writing. You would take case transcripts and then you would put them into arguments to take them to the higher court, and we could argue before the 3-judge court, but what we couldn't do in front of a jury. Now, this is also a point in time, there weren't women jurors in the 60s. I mean, being a woman, being a housewife was an automatic exemption to jury service. So the whole complexion, I mean, diversity of every kind was just a very unusual thing in the 60s and early 70s, and those doors began to open at a very fortunate point in time for me. So I actually fell in love with the work I was doing. I was asked to take over this newly created Special Victims Unit because I was a woman and because all the guys felt that rape cases were losing cases. Our laws were so bad that more than 1,000 men were arrested in New York City the year before I joined the office for sexual assault in the 5 counties. 18 of them were convicted. So we had laws that prevented us from taking women in the courtroom, and so these were not. This was not a career path for the guys who wanted to be in the homicide bureau, which is the most elite part of the office. And so nobody wanted to do sex crimes, and the DA said to me, I'd like you to do it. And I was the most senior woman in that part of the division. And I thanked him, and I said no, and I walked out the door. And I got as far as his chief assistant, and named John Keenan, who's a federal judge today, quite a fine one. And Keenan called me in, it was the Godfather era. And he said, you ever hear the expression, this is an offer you can't refuse? He said, the DA was not asking you a yes or no question when you want this job. He was asking you the question and you said, yes, sir, that's exactly what I want to do. And so I turned, complete U-turn, right around, back into the DA. So I thought about it for 6 minutes. And I would like to do that. And it became work. It's why I stayed in the office for 30 years. It was being there at a point in time when everything began to change. Because the feminist movement, if you get home in time tonight, there's a PBS show called Makers on 13 tonight. It's 3 hours and about the history of the women's movement. In the last hour tonight, I believe, I haven't seen it, is about law and laws and changing these laws and making things possible. And all that started to happen in the 70s when my colleagues and I were asked to do this work. For me, I never gave up the dream of writing. It's what I always wanted to do. So I would start every year, January 2, when I got into the office, I would start a journal, and I would start when the phone rang. Detective so-and-so, 19th precinct called, the alligator stuck in a closet, or whatever, all the bizarre police things. And by January 4th, I couldn't keep up with the phone calls and just the way any DA's office works. So I have all these journals from those early years that go about 8 pages of thrilling things that are blank the rest of the way because life took over. But I never gave up the dream of writing, and all throughout those years in the 70s and early 80s, people would come to us, many of them crime writers I didn't know at the time, but read, movie directors, and they would want, Morgenthau would let us do it not for money, but there was a little bit of good humored stuff at the end of the day, and you could sit down with Oliver Stone when he was doing Year of the Dragon and talk to him about crime in Chinatown. He could buy dinner and drinks, and there'd be 3 days sitting there. We were allowed that much. And finally, I just kept thinking to myself, I've always wanted to do this. Maybe I can do this too, not at Oliver Stone's level, but with some of the people who came in and out. And my first book was a nonfiction book. After we'd done a lot of legislative reform by the mid-1980s, the publisher came to me and asked if I would write a book about the changes in sexual assault laws and reform and the changes in attitudes. And I got the DA's permission, and I actually had to get permission from the city ethics board because in nonfiction I was writing about real cases and real names, and the city would have been liable if I was saying John Doe raped somebody and John Doe hadn't been convicted and his appeal perfected. So I got those permissions, and right before the Chambers case, so I procrastinated for about 4 years, 2 of which were actually the investigation and trial, over-bloated trial of that case that should have been a much quicker process. And so that book called Sexual Violence was published in '93, and I went back to the DA and said what I've always wanted to do is crime fiction. It's what I love to read, it's what fascinates me. And he just kind of waved his hand and said, everybody thinks they can write a book. Go ahead, just don't do it on city time, tell your stories. And that's when I started to write. We'll talk, I'm sure some of you will have questions. It was a much easier time to get things read. You could get things to an agent. There used to be a system called, over the transom, where you could submit unsolicited manuscripts. And I say this not meaning to joke at all. I'm very light and easy, but that part of the business stopped on 9/11 when nobody wanted anthrax in their mailbox and unsolicited mail. So literally, that's when most publishers shut down people's ability to just send in stuff to Dear Miss Smith. I know you're Elmore Leonard's agent, and I think I write like him, and can you do this? So for me, in the 90s, it was a much easier time to get read, and for I think anybody who was writing then and trying to get a submission. And one of my husband's best friends from his political days is a great literary agent, Esther Newberg at ICM, and she's a terrifying human being, but a very good friend. And so I used to see her on the street and just kind of freeze at the thought of making small talk with her. And she's the one who said to me, you've written a nonfiction book, you've proved to a publisher that you can tell a story, complete a book, have it published. So her expression literally was, stop whining about wanting to write crime fiction. You have what most people don't have. You have a friend who will read the book. So when I went off for summer vacation in '94, she said to me, don't get carried away. Don't write a novel. Not that I could have in the summer, but she said, try 50 or 60 pages and give it to me at the end of the summer, and I'll tell you whether I think you should go on or not. And so I wrote 64 pages of what became my first novel, Final Jeopardy, during that summer. And she gave me a green light and said, I thought the English lit majored me that my texture would just be terrific, and that I worried about things like dialogue. How do you have 4 cops in a story and give each of them a different tone and a different voice? And she came back to me and she said, your texture stinks. I like your dialogue, but the texture needs work. And so I went back at it with a whole new way to have to look at my own work. And eventually that's the book she sold. And she called me one night. I'd been at NYU doing a program at the law school, and she said, where are you? And I said, in a taxi. I thought she meant, can you talk? I said, in a taxi. She said, well, where's the taxi? And I said, I'm on Lexington Avenue and 23rd Street. And she said, well, that's where I want you. I want you never to forget that's where you were when I tell you that there's a bid on your book. And she said, Scribner's interested, but they want to know if you can write 2. And I said, I think I can write 10. I mean, that was I love series fiction, and I love that getting attached to characters you want to see back again. And it was always my dream to get into that world and create that. I don't know how my standalone friends do standalone. I don't know how I have such admiration for going to a new book every time and peopling it with entirely new figures. For me, it's a little bit like cheating, that when I go back, I've got my protagonist. I know what she does from the minute she opens her eyes till she goes to sleep. I know she would never turn left at a particular corner. I know what she drinks and when she drinks it and all of that. And my main characters as well. So series fiction is what I very much set out to do before I even put pen to paper. And it's a very, very happy world for me. I love to talk to people who are interested in doing it. The people who were good to me at the outset made all the difference in my getting into the hands of readers and to booksellers taking me seriously. And I love the craft. I love the people in the business of writing, and I love people in the art of writing, because it should be more that than a business, and unfortunately these days it doesn't seem to be. So that's my opening statement, and
That's a grand opening statement.